Hi, I'm Sherry from Whole Circle Studio, and welcome to the Starry Signs Block of the Month and Quilt Sew-Along. Today, I'm going to give you some tips as you begin to foundation paper piece your second Starry Signs block, the Aquarius constellation. In addition to this video, be sure to refer to the tips included in the pattern, as well as the links below to additional video tutorials. This month, I'm going to give you some tips for preparing your paper piecing templates. We're also going to review using water-soluble glue to secure your first section, and I have some general fabric tips for you. There are parts of my fabric that I like to apply spray starch to before cutting. I also find that I can reuse fabric scraps from my last block in this block. Also in this pattern, I mentioned matching dots on your paper pieces. I'm going to walk you through all of this. Let's get into it. It's really important to me for quilt patterns to be accessible and easy for everybody to print. And so for that reason, all of my quilt patterns are set up on a standard US letter size paper measuring 8.5 by 11. Some of the paper pieces are a little bit bigger than what will fit on a standard letter size page, so a little bit of assembly of the paper piecing templates is required. This process is similar to how you would piece together a pattern for clothing. So let me show you how I like to cut and tape these pieces. First, you can use scissors to cut. I have a rotary that's dedicated for paper, and I first cut out the pieces on the outer thinner lines. Before I cut, of course, I would measure that 1-inch box. Actually measures 1 inch. Then I'm going to cut pieces on the dashed lines. So for the dashed lines, what I'd like to do is on pieces that have dashed lines on the top or to the right of the paper piece. In this case, this is the bottom, this is the top. For this bottom piece, I'm going to leave a 1/2 inch of paper beyond the dashed line. So I'm just lining up my 1/2 inch indicator on my ruler and trimming. So I have a 1/2 inch beyond the dashed line. And for the piece on the top, I'm going to cut directly on that dashed line. I then will always refer to the pattern of how the paper pieces should be arranged. This one is pretty obvious, but some may not be as obvious, and I may need the little guide. Then to assemble the pieces, what I like to do is I am going to match up the dashed line, but also the X so that it completes. It is a completed X. And I kind of just shift that around. And I make sure the ends, the lines that are 1/4 inch in are also aligned. I find that having that extra 1/2 inch of overlap on one of the paper pieces makes this a lot easier, and also my pattern will be a lot more durable. It'll be easier to use and more accurate, I should say. It'll also be less floppy when I'm working with it. So, because it has a little bit of extra rigidity right here. And then I typically don't put any tape on the back side. That for the reason being, we're going to be pressing with an iron and the tape may melt to my fabric. I find that having it on the printed side of the paper will be fine. So again, having that overlap makes my template less floppy, more rigid, and also more accurate. So once these paper pieces are joined, you're going to ignore this dashed line as if it doesn't exist. So for section 8 here, which the dashed line intersects, I'm going to ignore that dashed line and treat this entire section right here as number 8. When I'm paper piecing, I find it helpful to use a water-soluble fabric glue stick to attach the fabric to the first section of each paper piece, just the first one. And I'll put the links below to my favorite glue sticks. These are a little bit pricier than regular glue sticks, the ones that are made for kids, but they make removing the paper later less frustrating. I find that plain glue sticks leave paper behind on your fabric, which could be a real pain at the end. I also find with these fabric glue sticks that they stick a little bit better to paper, applying them, than they do fabric. So I always apply the glue stick to the paper, and then I have my piece of fabric here. This is the incorrect side of the fabric, the correct side. So I'm going to have the incorrect side touching the back of the paper. I'll also hold it up to a light source to make sure that that fabric covers section 1. And now I'm ready to sew on section 2. Let's talk a little bit about fabric for block 2. I have a couple of tips. First, you'll notice on page 1 of the pattern, under cutting instructions, that you'll need to cut a fabric strip to complete the block. I recommend cutting this strip before cutting your fabric for the foundation paper piecing portion of the block. I also recommend starching your fabric prior to cutting the strip. And you only need to starch the area of the fabric that you're going to be using for this non-foundation paper piecing portion. I find that adding starch to this strip makes my piecing more accurate. If you're interested in applying starch to your fabric before cutting the fabric strip, be sure to check out my tutorial on my blog. The link is below. My second fabric tip is if you're using the same background fabric in block 2 as you did in block 1, and you pre-cut your fabric, be sure to go back to some of your fabric scraps from block 1. There's a good chance you can use some of these leftover scraps in this block. Before we wrap up, I want to show you a visual guide that will be on some of your Starry Sign block templates. When you're joining paper piece F to paper pieces G, H, and I, you'll notice 2 dots on each of these sections. Let's zoom in. I placed those there so it was super clear what ends you were matching up. So this matches up to this, not to that. It might have been a little bit confusing. So you can just visually match up the dots, or if you want to be super accurate, you can use a technique called positioning pinning. Let's take a look at what that looks like. So anytime that I have seams or points that I want to match up precisely, this is what I do. First, I'm going to go ahead and place my pieces correct sides together. And then I use a super thin pin to align the dots. The thinner the pin, the more accurate the results. And I really like this brand of pins. It's called Iris Superfine because they are thin and they don't bend easily. I'm going to put a link to these below. I then pin both of my pieces together. So first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to take the pin and I'm going to put it through the point, or in this case, the dot. And then I am going to carefully approximate where that other dot is, and it's not quite on it. Sometimes this part takes a couple of tries. And that looks pretty close. So then what I do is I put the pin, kind of push the pin through, and I want to make sure that it is perpendicularly facing out, almost like so it makes a T versus slanted like this or like this, and that I'm exaggerating. But if it's perfectly out this way, that means both points are perfectly aligned. And then I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to take another pin and I'm going to use that pin to secure the two pieces together. And then very, very important, I want to make sure I take out that positioning pin. Otherwise, it might get hung up in my machine. So the other end I can visually match up, but I actually find that I get better results if I go ahead and I do the same thing, positioning pin. Now there's no dot here, but I know that I want that angle right there to align with that point. So I'm going to use that as a reference and stick my pin through here. Again, I'm going to approximate where I think it is, turn it over. I think I want to get a little bit more accurate. That looks good to me. I'm going to push it through, make sure it's perpendicular, and then I'm going to secure the two pieces together with another pin. And again, very important, take out this positioning pin. I'll also sometimes just do it on the positioning pinning technique on sort of longer pieces. If I really want to make sure that my seam allowances are consistent. So here I'm just gonna first I'll just try by having the raw edges aligned, and I'm just going to pick an arbitrary point and stick it through on the line, flip it over. Yeah, see, that's not quite on the line, which means my seam allowances would be a little bit off. So I'm just going to adjust that. I'm going to scooch it over a little. And that looks better. Make sure everything lays nice and flat. Make sure it's out straight. And then I could secure those together. And I can do this as much as I want or as little as I want. If pinning is not your jam, that's totally fine. Or these probably are probably pretty consistent, the seam allowances. I could just pin or not pin. I tend to do more pinning because it's less things I have to pay attention to when I'm on the machine, and I find I get better results. So I like to use this technique all the time to align seams, critical seams, when I'm foundation paper piecing, but also just traditional piecing. And if you're interested in learning more about this technique, I have a mini video tutorial all about it called How to Perfectly Align and Match Your Seams, and I'll link to it below. I can't wait to see your block come together. Thanks again for being here and for sewing along with us. I'll be back next month with even more tips. And if you enjoyed this video, please be sure to give it a thumbs up and don't forget to subscribe so you never miss a new tutorial. Be sure to share your quilt block progress with me. Email me a photo of your block so I could share it in our online gallery. My email address can be found on the pattern. Or you could share your photo on Instagram. Be sure to tag me so I don't miss your post. See you next month, and happy sewing.